So, dear friends and colleagues, it's a great pleasure and indeed an honor to be able to welcome you all to Norway and to Oslo for this symposium, which we've titled Democracy and its Trajectories, India at 70. Let me start by saying on behalf of Kenneth, Anand, and myself that we really do appreciate greatly that you've made time and in very many cases traveled far to participate in 2 days of discussion about the complex and indeed contradictory trajectories of Indian democracy across the 7 decades that have unfolded since independence in 1947. I'm going to say a few words in order to set the stage for our discussions, but before I get to that, I'd like to acknowledge that it's due to the Norwegian Research Council that we have been able to organize this event. Over the past 3 years, the NRC has generously funded the work of myself and my 2 colleagues, Kenneth and Anand, and this event is in part intended to mark the formal conclusion of our project, which is entitled Democratizing Indian Democracy, with a question mark. Through this project, we have sought over the last 3 years to investigate the relationship between social movements, state formation, and processes of democratic deepening in India from the 1920s until the present. And I should add to that we're currently working on a manuscript that explores this dynamic through the contentious politics of lawmaking. So watch this space, if you will. Now, there is, as I said, a question mark at the end of the title of our project, and that question mark is in many ways a good starting point for addressing the theme of this symposium. Now, as we all know, the remarkable stability, longevity, and vibrancy of India's democracy compares very favorably with other countries and regions in the global south. The coming of national independence in 1947 witnessed the introduction of universal franchise and a system of electoral democracy that, with the exception of the emergency period from 1975 to 1977, has remained stable for close to 7 decades. Indian elections, or for 7 decades. Indian elections, as media pundits never tire of telling us, are the largest exercises in universal franchise anywhere in the world. And significantly, the poor and the marginalized exercise their right to vote more eagerly and in greater proportion than India's middle classes and elites. Indeed, the fact that Indian democracy has struck such deep popular roots is undoubtedly an important reason for its stability, its longevity, and its vibrancy. Now, when India's democracy was born 70 years ago, its birth was accompanied by an ambitious promise. The future beckons to us, Nehru said, as he addressed the country's Constituent Assembly while the midnight hour approached on the 14th of August, 1947. Whither do we go and what shall be our endeavor, he asked, before proceeding to outline the grand vision, and I quote, to bring freedom and opportunity to the common man, to the peasants and workers of India, to fight and end poverty and ignorance and disease, to build up a prosperous, democratic, and progressive nation, and to create social, economic, and political institutions which will ensure justice and fullness of life to every man and woman. If it's indisputable that India's democracy has stood the test of time in a remarkable manner and has struck deep roots among the country's subaltern groups, it's equally clear that one of its central contradictions resides in the fact that the aspiration of ensuring precisely justice and fullness of life to every man and woman has been betrayed in some very fundamental ways. Some 41.3% of India's population lives in poverty, and this is despite the fact that for several years and until recently, the country has registered the highest rates of economic growth in the world. This failure to translate growth into development is perhaps most clearly manifest in the fact that India's social development indicators are weaker than those of its poorer neighbors in the South Asian region. And as recent data has revealed, after several decades of market-oriented reforms, inequality has increased in India to levels not witnessed since the late 1930s. Indeed, the fact that 57 billionaires now own as much wealth as the poorest 70% of the population suggests that in its 70th year of independence, the country seems to be witnessing the re-emergence of the 2 Indias decried by Dadabhai Naoroji in the early years of the 20th century, one prosperous, the other poverty-stricken, as he put it. And we know, of course, that women, Dalits, lower-caste groups, precarious workers, and Adivasis are vastly overrepresented among those who inhabit the poverty-stricken India. In other words, while formal democracy embodied precisely in universal suffrage, regular competitive elections, and legally codified rights of association, has stood its ground well in India over the past 70 years. There is still much that's wanting in terms of substantive democracy. That is, a form of democratic rule that enables subaltern groups to exercise their rights and make real gains in terms of redistribution and recognition. 2 years after Nehru's lofty remarks on the eve of independence, B.R. Ambedkar gave his last speech to the Constituent Assembly that he had chaired for almost 3 years. And I quote, "On the 26th of January 1950, he told the Assembly, we are going to enter into a life of contradictions. In politics, we will have equality, and in social and economic life, we will have inequality. Given that those contradictions have survived, entrenched not only in the form of unequally distributed wealth, but in gender injustice and caste-based discrimination and violence, we should perhaps be surprised that Ambedkar's prophecy, also issued in this speech, that subaltern groups would ultimately blow up the structures of political democracy if inequality was not addressed, has actually failed to materialize. On the contrary, in the context of the Modi regime, the main threats to India's democracy appears to come from above, not from below. Since Modi took charge in Delhi in 2014, violence against Muslims and Dalits has proliferated. Lynchings, which have escalated strongly in 2017, can be seen as an expression that Hindu nationalists feel that they have free rein to use violence and fear to promote their majoritarian agenda in Indian society. The attacks are also part of a wider authoritarian tendency that is having an adverse impact on India's public sphere. Dissidents and activists, as well as students, academics, and journalists who are critical of Modi's regime are regularly accused of being anti-national and subjected to harassment, silencing, and in some cases murderous violence. This tendency showed us its ugliest face exactly 1 month ago today, when Gauri Lankesh, a progressive journalist who was known and indeed dear to many in this room, was murdered by assassins outside her home in Bangalore. It goes without saying that the killing of a fearless journalist has dangerous portents for democracy. And even more so, of course, when forensic evidence reveals that there are tangible links between the murder of Gauri Lankesh and the killings of M.M. Kalburgi, Govind Pansare, and Narendra Dapolkar, all activists and scholars who paid with their lives for challenging the Hindutva project. In this conjuncture, then, it is arguably more important than ever to pursue expansive and critical conversations about the trajectories of Indian democracy, from its origins in struggle via its contradictory present moment to its possible futures, also no doubt, to be forged in and through struggle. How did castes and class power shape the making of India's post-colonial democracy? In what ways were the particularities of the freedom struggle inscribed in its constitution? And how can we understand the constitutive role of violence in the making of the Indian Republic? How have women's struggles in and through the feminist movement expanded democratic meanings and practices? What challenges does the media confront in India today, and what role can it play in animating and maintaining the pulse of the country's democracy? These are some of the questions that we will discuss and address during these 2 days. And we will also investigate the contemporary life of caste in discourses of merit, the lineages of the rise of the Hindu right, the status of secularism and religious pluralism in the context of a revived Hindutva project, and not least the politics of counterinsurgency and the limits of democratic legality in contemporary India. Now, I would not want these opening remarks to leave the impression that we are conducting these conversations in a context where Indian democracy is at immediate risk of unraveling. However, I do think it might be fair to say that the future of India's tryst with destiny seems increasingly to rest in the hands of those who have not given up faith that it is possible to win social justice. The women who protest sexual violence and patriarchal power, the Dalits who reject caste discrimination and demand equality, the intellectuals who practice their right to free speech and dissent, the peasants and Adivasis who fight against dispossession, and the slum dwellers and workers who assert the right to dignified lives and livelihoods. I hope this is a thought that we can consider as we pursue our dialogues over these 2 days, both in terms of the ongoing contest for the core of Indian democracy and in terms of what a more substantive form of democracy might look like. Now, we have a lot to talk about, obviously, as you can tell, and we're going to get right to it. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Toilets are down the hall and on the right. The Wi-Fi, which is probably more important than toilets even, is simply Centralen, and it's open. And lunch for our symposium participants today is at 12:45. It'll be served in here. I think that's about it. So without much further ado, I'd like to invite Anupama, Sunil, and Shandipto, along with Pamela, who will be the chair of our first panel, to take the floor, and we'll take it from there.